السر منا لا تهتك الستر عنا الله عافنا واعف عنا وكلنا حيث كنا.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah, let us begin our session today with Ummul Kitab Al-Fatiha. A'udzu billahi minasyaitonir rajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin arrahmanir rahim maliki yaumiddin iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in ihdinas siratal mustaqim siratal ladzina an'amta 'alaihim ghairil maghdubi 'alaihim waladdallin amin. Well, alhamdulillah, it's been a while. We did pause for the month of Ramadan. So we will continue today to discuss Renaissance philosophy. So if you're all with me, I will proceed to discuss the outlines. Of course, a number of things had to be said. In terms of what the Renaissance means, the scholars refer this period as roughly, say, between the 15th and the 16th centuries. Some scholars, they date the end of the... Hello? Okay. Some scholars, they date the end of the Renaissance period as the publication of Descartes' Discourse on Method, which was 1637, which marks the beginning of early modern philosophy. Nevertheless, Descartes himself, who stands at the end of the Renaissance period, was himself trained in the Jesuit tradition. So therefore, there's certainly continuities with the previous tradition, and the Renaissance itself, although it produces a new set of historical coherences, bears some level of continuity with the Middle Ages that preceded it. So if we remember the last time when we discussed the philosophy of the Middle Ages, there is a corporate nature to how philosophy is conducted. It was mainly the universities that became the center for the philosophical discourses, and there was a certain particular structure. We talked about the lecture, say for example, the notion of commenting upon the text, the development of the scholastic tradition, and the writing of Sume, meaning to say a philosophical piece or philosophical treatise, which is basically like a set of carefully argued propositions in a syllogistic fashion. And so therefore there had to be preparatory sciences, yes, the trivium and the quadrivium, which is required before you can continue to delve into the text. So it's a very textual based exercise. Some of the late medieval thinkers, the likes of Aquinas, Duns Scotus, William of Ockham, and several others, continue to exercise influence in the Renaissance period. And furthermore, we know that during the Middle Ages, the universities also receive influence from, or continue to receive influence from the Islamic intellectual tradition, particularly through Averroes, because in the 14th, or yes, towards the end of the higher Middle Ages, Aquinas, for example, was involved in debates with the Latin Averroists, and also several ideas that comes from the Islamic intellectual tradition continue to influence, particularly, for example, the Maqasidul Falasifah of Imam al-Ghazali, which became translated into Latin as the intentions of the philosophers, and also the ideas of Ibn Sina, which continue to form part of the structure of the Thomistic philosophy. There was several changes by the time we get to the Renaissance period, meaning to say, during the Renaissance, there were several things that occurred that changed the character of philosophy. One was that within Christianity itself, within the scholastic tradition, there continued to be now different, shall we say, approaches to the fundamental problems. I suppose we might have mentioned in connection to medieval philosophy that the central discussion or debate with regards to the Middle Ages center around, first and foremost, how to negotiate the relative places of theology and philosophy. Philosophy has been treated as the handmaiden of theology, meaning to say philosophy is used in service to prove theological points. And in Aquinas, he established within the synthesis how you can gradually proceed from, say, philosophical discourses until you reach at the precipice of theology. The other major discussion, other than the reason revelation discourse, is the discussion of the nature of the universals. Aquinas, if you remember, having been influenced by Ibn Sina, held that the universals are existing as creative ideas in the mind of God, and particularized in the particular individuals that we see external to us, which the mind abstracts into the form of, say, universals in the mind. William of Ockham, a very important figure to initiate the movement towards the Renaissance period, opined that these universals in reality are non-existent. The only existing things are, shall we say, the individual particulars in the external world. So what we assume as a yellowness that arrives in our mind, through which every yellow particular object has that attribute or property. And now this is just, shall we say, fiction created in our mind. In reality, the only existing thing are the concrete particulars. So this position then came to be known as nominalism, meaning to say that nomina, meaning to say referring to the names of particular things alone. So denying the existence of, shall we say, the universals altogether. This gradually prepared for the direction that the Renaissance period philosophy was to take, which was to focus on the external world. And this was another debate within the history of Christian philosophy about whether or not the world was a source of knowledge, or whether or not the world was a distraction to the source of knowledge. Augustine, if we remember, focused on, say, the intellectus aspect, meaning to say the turning towards the supernatural as opposed to the realm of nature, which has been denigrated. Aquinas tried to bring in contemplation about the world as a preparation to perceive or to understand the existence of God, but his being, shall we say, connected to Aristotelianism meant that there were several, shall we say, positions that he was committed to, including, of course, the priority of, say, the ratio, the ratiocinative aspect of the intellect, meaning to say the logical organizing principles and the tendency towards naturalism, the world as being a self-contained principle, which again prepares the road to the 15th and 16th century philosophy. Now on to the 15th and 16th centuries, which is the period of the Renaissance. The center, some of the characteristics of this period. First, you have the changing character of philosophy from the corporate character, which tended to focus on the university, to the deed of individuals. The universities began to give way to individual philosophers, usually under patronage, of course, shifting its centers, whereas previously it was the University of Paris and the universities in several parts of, say, Paris and Oxford that came to be the centers of theology. In the Renaissance period, you had several new centers in Florence, in Wittenberg, and other parts of Germany, and several other centers. And these places, they now tended to produce a new breed of philosophers. In particular, let's just say some of the traditions that now are at war with each other are, say, the Aristotelians, the Platonists, the humanists, and the skeptics. These are the major schools that made a comeback. Why the period is called the Renaissance? Rebirth is because the period of the Renaissance is when Western culture and civilization made an reinterpretive discovery of several Greek and Latin texts that tended to be ignored in the earlier period. What I mean by that is that although the Middle Ages was highly influenced by Aristotle, there was only about 2.5 dialogues of Plato that existed in Latin that was commented upon during the Middle Ages. During the Renaissance period, more and more of the writings of Plato came to be translated in full in Latin, made available. And furthermore, there were several inventions that were important in that time, including the printing and the movable type. So that meant that philosophy can travel further. And we know that during the Renaissance period, you had the figures such as Nikolai Copernicus, who was very influential in natural philosophy, in that he wrote the revolution of the heavenly spheres. Yes, the revolution of the heavenly spheres that challenged the dominance of the geocentric theory in physics, meaning to say the one that puts the Earth at the center of the universe, where the celestial objects gravitate or rather revolve around it. So through his brilliant mathematical calculations, he made the alternative supposition that rather it was the sun that was at the center of the universe. So Nikolai Copernicus was in Poland, yes, but yet the printing of his work, which was done after his death or the year of his death, was printed in Wittenberg in Germany. And so there were now greater movements. So with the of say thought, and at the same time greater production of literary and philosophical literature available. And secondly, there was also the rise of nation states, yes, and nationalism, which is also partly fueled by the religious wars. We see that concurrent with the Renaissance was the Reformation of Christianity that produced the very influential reformers, such as the like of Martin Luther, Zwingli, and John Calvin. That certainly what it created was a schisms within Christianity. No longer then can the Catholics maintain or retain its universal status. No longer can they maintain the continuities of the medieval period, wherein thought was centered around religious themes, was that thought tended to gravitate from the concentric circle of Rome unto the several other places. Now you have different nation states which tended to align with the different religious movements, of course partially because of power, but also at the same time breaking apart Europe and producing nation states. With new realization of this type came new needs for philosophy. And furthermore, you have, as a result of the religious wars and the rise of the nation states, the strengthening of literature in the vernacular languages, meaning to say Italian, German, gradually English and French. So philosophy came to be written in these different languages, which was before that the monopoly of Latin and the monopoly of priests. So then this is the basic shall we say context of Renaissance philosophy. At the same time, in about the 15th century or so, several states, such as Portugal and Spain, came on voyages of, say, discovery and conquest, what they call the Reconquista, when they managed to regain, say, Spain from the Muslims and gradually started their expeditions, yes, and colonization. 100 leagues to the west and to the east, yes, between the Portuguese and the Spaniards, conquering places as far as Peru and say the South Americas and over on the eastern front also. So then this also created new questions of philosophy. So the shift in the philosophical focus is now that it is no longer dedicated to metaphysical speculation alone, but philosophy now is required to serve the demands of the nation state, i.e., the birth and the birth or the rise of political philosophy, and also at the same time questions of ethics became treated, and at the same time, as we say that with the interpretive discovery of the Greek texts of, say, Plato, and the Latin works such as the ones by Cicero and the humanists of the late antiquity, there was also the rise of humanism, which then turned their backs on, say, the syllogism as the highest method in philosophy, in preference for grammar and rhetoric, in preference for writing, say, philosophical works which are also poetic in nature, writing philosophical works that also appealed to one's sense of aesthetics, that appeal to one's sense of, say, emotions and feelings. And this is the likes of the Renaissance humanists, such as Desiderius, Erasmus, some of them Christians, yes, including, of course, Petrarch, yes, who wanted to revive, Latin humanism unto the Renaissance period. Thus far, is my explanation cogent? Is it understandable? Because it's very strange to be speaking alone like this. Do you follow my explanations? Well then, let us continue a bit more then. So, as we said about the character of philosophy, so first we said is the influence of the humanists with their spirit of celebrating the human being. Then we said also of the continuity of the scholastic tradition. Let us mention a bit about the rise of political philosophy and the continuity of the scholastic tradition. So, amongst the scholastic thinkers of this time was a certain Vittorio. Let me see. Yes, Francisco Vitoria is his name. He was influenced by Thomas Aquinas, but his chief focus was on Aquinas's political philosophy. Remember the fact that now the Spaniards are, say, ruthlessly going into places such as the South Americas and attacking the what are called the Indians that they discovered there in the places of the Indies. It produces new ethical questions. Can, say, the Pope give justification of the conquest of other countries? What would be the pretext of that, of, say, the Christians going into another land to conquer the land? What would be the requirements? So this is outlined in his doctrine of the just war and the doctrine of the law between nations. This was the time that it was being formulated. Francisco de Vitoria outlined that there are several laws, what he called the divine law, the eternal law, natural law, and then there is civil law. Accordingly, polities which enact civil law must do so in the interest of natural law, which abides in the entire universe. As for the eternal law and the divine law, now this depends on revelation, on scripture, and how God governs the universe. As for natural law, it can be discovered by human reason. So according to Francisco de Vitoria, that when it comes to, say, nations, the only, say, justification for Christian polities to attack another country is when, say, for example, Christians are being persecuted in those lands, or in response to attack by those lands, or say, for example, if those lands are being governed by, say, unjust tyrants, meaning to say those tyrants who run the country based on their whims and fancies, contrary to the dictates of natural law. So according to Vittorio, or rather Francisco de Vitoria, when it comes to the affairs of the Spaniards in South America, there is totally no justification of that, because he said that certainly there were no Christians who were being persecuted, and certainly there was no retaliation on the part of the Spaniards. It was surely fueled by their own expansionist dreams. And furthermore, to use the justification of, say, liberating um, the, um, uh, the Indies, the South Americas, is, shall we say, too far of a stretch, because based on the existence of the institutions of the natives of the land and how they govern themselves, surely they show that they are capable of governing themselves, and they were not running contrary to the dictates of natural reason. Of course, he was in debate at that time with those who would justify using Aristotelian means. For example, part of say the doctrines of Aristotle in the politics suggest that there is a certain sort of natural hierarchy amongst mankind. There are certain human beings who are natural slaves, shall we say, based on the Aristotelian conception. Those who cannot rule on their behalf, meaning to say those who are permanently immature, that requires constant guidance. Now, this sort of justification was not accepted by Francisco de Vitoria. Nevertheless, as what we know, political philosophy continued to flourish and to extend itself in the literature of the Mirror of Princes, meaning to say works which are written for princes who are now forming their own governance structures in order to secure power and glory. Of course, many of the earlier tradition of the Mirror of Princes tend to focus on, say, virtue as the governing principle. It was Niccolo Machiavelli that broke with tradition, that suggested that the virtue that ought to be cultivated by the rulers, rather, is the one that secures power and glory, not virtue for its own sake. So Machiavelli turned this tradition of virtue on its head, and allowing himself, so to speak, to advise the princes of his time to develop this notion that would later become identified as Machiavellianism. And several things that became known, say, for example, the notion that if a king should choose, or a prince should choose either to be feared or to be loved, it's better to be both. But if you should choose, then it is better to choose to be feared than to be loved. And several other realist tactics were being promoted by Machiavelli. Yes, so that's part and parcel of what we call the Renaissance period political philosophy. As we said, that the Renaissance period extend well into the earlier half of the 17th century. By the late 16th century and the beginning of the 17th century, there was Europe became involved with the 30 Years' War, involving the several schisms of the Christians, the Protestants and the Catholics, which invited the great mind of that time, Thomas Hobbes, and several others to pen treatises on political philosophy that would ensure the stability, the political stability of Europe onwards. But more on that when we discuss early modern philosophy. Nevertheless, moving on from political philosophy and humanism, which we have discussed, humanism did not produce much of a doctrine of, say, metaphysics or epistemology, which was not really their concern. Their concern was the celebration of, say, the rhetoric and the aesthetic abilities of mankind, but it shaped the spirit of the time, because we know that the Renaissance is also very well known for its aesthetic elements, the cultural aspects, such as the architecture of the times, the paintings of the times, all receiving the influence of humanism. So basically, the Renaissance aspect was, the Renaissance period tended more and more towards the outward element of civilization. according to Wilhelm Windelband, even before the rise of the Renaissance period, within, say, the Middle Ages, there was really already a secular undercurrent that was developing together with the religious overtone. But this secular undercurrent gradually came towards the end of the Middle Ages to a self-conscious strengthening of itself. Now, this self-conscious strengthening of the secular elements of the civilization would then burst forth into the surface in the Renaissance period with the factors that I have previously mentioned. We have previously mentioned and discussed. So, with the rise of, the humanist literature, came also the revival of skepticism. The revival of skepticism is interesting because it is one of the central features of the Renaissance period that prepared the grounds for early modern philosophy and the movement away from the control of the church, and the movement away from the syllogism, and the movement away from the stranglehold, shall we say, of Aristotelian authority in philosophy. The skepticism, meaning to say that criticizes the metaphysical pretensions of the schools, allowed for new ventures into philosophy. So for as long as they can defend their theory of knowledge and their theory of metaphysics. So that's the purpose of, say, the most important, shall we say, apology for skepticism was written by Michel de Montaigne, yes, in a tract which is called An Apology for Raymond Sebon. In that tract, he outlined, for example, the problem with the metaphysicians is that they couldn't, despite the long years of controversy, they have not resolved the basic metaphysical disagreements. One can hold to one position and another holds another, and they are unable to resolve it, suggesting that metaphysics is not a science. In other words, that you should leave matters of metaphysics to the realm of faith or theology, which again prepares the ground for the rise of the secular civilization. Since I have now discussed the major currents, the three currents, yes, as I said, humanism, the continuous, shall we say, inheritance of the scholastics, and thirdly, as I mentioned, the skepticism. I would like to spend, say, the remaining time that we do have to discuss, I think, a very interesting development. Personally, I think this is the central key figure, central element of Renaissance philosophy that allowed for the rise of natural science in the modern period. And this is the role of the Neoplatonists, such as initially the likes of Pico della Mirandola and Marsilio Ficino. These Platonists, or rather Neoplatonists, have taken into their, say, philosophical systems not only the Neoplatonic tradition, say, from Plotinus down to late antiquity, but also I believe, if we have studied the development of Islamic, say, metaphysical tradition, some elements of Islamic thought have been incorporated therein, and I will discuss this further afterwards. So, in the most, shall we say, interesting system developed in the Renaissance period philosophy, I would say these are the systems of Giordano Bruno and Jacob Boehme. In Bruno and Boehme and several others, they discuss the notion of nature as a macrocosm and man as a microcosm. And they use very powerful metaphors that evoke in our intellect the notion of the universe as an organized principle, a macrocosm, as the organized principle. The idea is that despite the apparent defects that is seen in individual objects, if the mind is able to transcend the individual objects, the individual defects would vanish from your observation in the totality and in the beauty of the whole. This is a further development of the Neoplatonist notion of the beauty of the universe as the manifestation of the divine essence. But in Bruno and in Bohème, what we find is that the manifestation of the divine essence in this case tended towards a degree of pantheism and a degree of monism, as if the external world as we see it, this macrocosm, is in fact God. The world is God and God is the world, shall we say. But this identification of God and the world has fine distinctions. In particular, say there are two aspects of the macrocosm. One aspect of the macrocosm is called the natura naturata, the element of nature that is the source of the organizing principle. Bruno uses the metaphor of a primitive light that is the ground of existence. Yes. Bohème uses the organistic sort of metaphor, meaning to say that there is a divine sort of sap, a seed, yes, that contains within itself the entirety of the universe to be developed into a tree with its, shall we say, with its branch, with its root, and then its branch, and then gradually its flower, and then its fruits, all contained within the germinal activity of the initial sap just now. So, although this image may register in our mind as if since the world began within the seed that developed into this tree, as if the tree as a whole is this, say, single sap, they are careful to introduce fine distinctions, because although the world is a manifestation of that primitive light, the world is a manifestation of that initial sap, yet it is not the entire manifestation. It is but aspects and modes of this divine being. And this divine being possesses, say, attributes of all-knowingness, all-hearingness, all-hearing, all-knowing, and all-willing. It is the organizing aspect. It is the principle as well as the cause of the entirety of existence. It organizes nature. So nature, as beholden to our senses, is but the manifestation. It is the natura naturans, meaning to say the element that has now been, it's no longer infinite. The being in itself is infinite, but the being of the world in its particular aspects, they are limited, and they are, say, aspects, they are manifestations of that initial ground of being, including man himself. Interestingly also, Bruno tried to develop this initial insight of the relationship between man and the universe, the macrocosm and microcosm, within a new cosmology. The cosmology that he takes to be the Copernican heliocentric system. Yes, Giordano Bruno conceived of the world as being, say, infinitely expanding within space. In other words, that this solar system, of which although previously they have already affirmed that it is possible that the world is spherical and rotates around its own axis, within the Copernican system that Giordano Bruno adopted, he mentions that there is a movement, say, from chaos to organization, and then the existence of life that revolves around the sun. But he's saying that there are potentially billions, or rather potentially unlimited amounts of existing existing, say, solar systems, of which the sun becomes centers of being. One comes into existence and then disappears, and another one comes into existence and disappears, and so on. So the universe is a realm of multiple worlds that tends towards this organizing, all coming from that ground, the same ground of being. Now, this fantastic system, I suppose, if we have studied the metaphysical schemes of our Muslim scholars, we will see some resemblance. And I'm not surprised if to find out that some of the ideas, because certainly it is not inherent in Christianity, nor is it inherent in the initial presentation of, say, Neoplatonism previous to the time of Islam. But this basic idea of the macrocosm is the alamul kabir and the alamul saghir. This would only be made apparent truly in the writings of the Sufi metaphysicians, which, of course, these later people in the 15th and the 16th centuries would have adopted, but to fit within their own, say, either Christian or pantheistic metaphysical schemes that would then prepare itself for the coming of the future. At the same time, as we speak about the macrocosm, there is also the notion of the microcosm of man. Man, according to Bruno and Patrizzi, Boehm, they consider man being a microcosm, meaning to say as a sort of a miniature copy of that external organizing principle. Man in body is a summary of the entire universe, meaning to say that the elements of the entire universe coalesce within the bodily structure of man. Not only that, man contains within himself the element of the intellect. Now that element of the intellect is capable of absorbing the multiplicity of forms that exist in the external world. And furthermore, it contains the spirit element. And it is this spirit element that has a resemblance with the ground of being, in that it possesses attributes of knowledge, willing, and several others, such as seeing and so on, to suggest that the ultimate aims of knowledge is union with that central ground of being. Now, so far, if we only follow the metaphysics and the epistemology, we would say that there's a lot of resemblance between this system and the previous systems that is produced by the Muslim scholars and the philosophers. And surely, if they have developed from out of each other, they would have taken these elements and adopted it within their metaphysical scheme. However, there is a crucial difference because Bruno, Boehm, and several others, they use this scheme for different purposes. For Bruno, he is and several others like Cornelius of Agrippa, they are unsatisfied with this metaphysical discussion. What they want is to develop several of the occult sciences, astrology being one of them, yes, the study of the influence of the stars on the human beings, alchemy being another major preoccupation of that time, and well, being the object of alchemy, of course, is the transmutation of base metals into higher degree of metals. They were very much concerned with, shall we say, discovering the philosopher's stone that can perform this task of transmutation. And thirdly, they were also very much interested in necromancy, sihir, or say the science of magic. Many published works at that time focus on the notion of demonology, witchcraft, and so on. So basically, despite having some resemblance, it is now populated with this worldview of, filled with magical elements and so on. Boehm tried to establish his system within the Christian outlook of the battle between good and evil. He even coined, he even included within his system the notion of the fall and original sin, the function of Lucifer, and so on and so forth. Which is, and in this regard, if we consider that the period that I am talking about is the 16th century, many of them writing during that time, this was also in the Malay world, the century of Hamzah al-Fansuri. And Hamzah al-Fansuri, while talking about some of these things and using some of the same metaphors, utilize this conceptual apparatus for the sake of Sharia, Tariqah, yes, Haqiqah, and Ma'rifah. The purpose is knowledge of God, and the purpose is ethical development. In other words, the purpose is to return to the true teachings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The metaphysical categories that he introduces merely highlighted the centrality of Tawheed within his system, but not the developments of the other so-called sciences, the occult sciences of the 15th and the 16th centuries. Nevertheless, it is this conception of the macrocosm and the microcosm that would then pave the road, since now, I mean, whereas Christianity tended to focus inwardly, and Christianity tended to focus on the deductive method, despite developing Aristotle, this movement towards the natural world as the proper subject of philosophy would have been now the proper grounds of the development of natural philosophy or science in the century after. So then I think that concludes briefly our survey of the the Renaissance period philosophy. Inshallah, in our next meeting, we will discuss the early modern period, the 17th century. All right. Now that we have, completed part one of our discussion, I would like to invite the participants to ask questions if there are any. I have received now one about how does one discern the hylomorphism and atomism, and between these two, which of this is ascribed for Sunnism? As we say, hylomorphism, the doctrine defended by Aristotle, considers, shall we say, the realm of nature as being eternal, and that it is consisting of material hyle, prime substances, and this prime substance is, shall we say, formless, but the form aspect is the one that shapes this material substance into what it becomes. So Aristotle introduces the fourfold spectacles of final cause, formal cause, efficient cause, yes, and material cause of the being of a thing. So therefore, basically, it is committed to a notion of the eternity of the world and the persistence of individual beings and substances as hayula. So the generation and corruption involves, therefore, the coming into being of things and its dissolution, and another one coming into being and then its dissolution, and so on, for so long as say nature persists. As for atomism, although the term has been used in the Greek period, defended by the likes of Democritus and Epicurus, yes, the way it has been formulated by the Sunni theologians like Al-Baqillani, and then later on by the likes of An-Nasafi and several others, their notion of atomism is the idea that the world being consists of, say, atoms, meaning to say indivisible particulars. What are called indivisible particulars are what is called juz'un ladhi la yatajazza, yes, the smallest possible particle, yes, that can no longer, which does not possess magnitude, but once it came together, it produces bodies. But it is the act of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that produces things coming into existence and then taking it out of existence. So therefore, it has been, the notion of atomism in Islam is closely tied with the notion of continuous generation and dissolution. So being, or rather existence, is endowed of these individual substances by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He then removes its character of existence. So on top of this, the atoms, that when they combine together produce accidents such as color, such as its smell, and several other accidents of the substance when joined together as a body. There is also the temporal element, which is also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala renewing it. So this, therefore, the atomism that is ascribed is designed in such a way so as to return formal efficacy only to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It combines together with the occasionalism of the Ash'ari school that talks about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the sole cause of things, meaning to say that there is no internal cause and effect within one substance that leads to another thing, except that these are rather sunnatullah. These are God's customary way of acting, of creating into the world something which is a manifestation of His knowledge. Yeah, so that's briefly the difference between the two. And as we said, it is the atomism that has been explained as part and parcel of the system of say some of the Sunni theologians. It is not true that all the Sunni theologians, discuss the notion of atoms For some, they consider that these things is beyond, beyond the requirements of of the aqidah. Meaning to say, we can suspend judgment about it. Um, uh, in the if you look at the Farq Bain al-Firaq of Abdul Qahir al-Baghdadi, several other physical theories were being said to be so as to be part of the theological discussion, but the later muhakkikin consider that some of these positions are not necessarily part and parcel, shall we say, of say Islamic theology. It's just that it was the position that they consider within the overall rational system the most plausible in explaining change, generation, and corruption within the Islamic worldview without the need to commit to, say, the notion of an eternal universe, without the need to commit to the notion of cause and effect, which challenge the sole efficacy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Are there any other questions?
Yes, I have one question, Syed.
Yes.
Boleh
Professor.
dengar ke?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you so much for the very, very interesting talk. I just would like for you to tell me something about this skepticism. You mentioned about skepticism just now. Skepticism, as I've read, it also exists in the 17th century, as in Thomas Hobbes, Baruch Spinoza, and also as in Kant Emmanuel. And Kant's skepticism has very great influence on the German philosophy. And then after that, the German philosophy has great influence to the modern world now. So Kant says that metaphysics and philosophy was mostly illegitimate. Why does Kant did not want to see the importance of the philosophy and the metaphysics?
Yes. Alhamdulillah, this is a very good question. It's a bit of jumping the gun, because we're going to discuss early modern philosophy and then gradually Enlightenment philosophy. But I think it's okay to address these things, because we will, inshallah, address it within a systematic formulation. But let's just say briefly that the skepticism that was fostered in the Renaissance period persists well into the 17th and 18th century. Now, to be sure, skepticism as a philosophical position is of various degrees. It is very difficult in practice for a person to conceive of a person who is a total skeptic with regards to everything. Meaning to say, theoretically, you can be a skeptic with regards to the deliverance of the senses. Meaning to say, you can doubt whether or not what your senses perceive of the external world is correct. But in essence, in practice, if you were to live like that, then it's impossible to live, because you would doubt about the existence of water, and you would have doubt whether or not you're healthy, or you have a fever, and so on and so forth. In other words, in truth, skepticism is a sort of weapon which is wielded by philosophers, thinkers, particularly to destroy a philosophical structure. Meaning to say, it was fostered in the Renaissance period to challenge the dominance of scholastic philosophy. Why? Because, there were several reasons, certainly, because they saw first, in the 30 Years' War that affected the first half of the 17th century, countless of people died, or meaning to say, a great number of people died in the skirmishes between people who are very confident of their religious beliefs. Meaning to say, both people who claim to come from the same religion claim greater epistemic adherence to the truth of Christianity, that what they have is the truth, until they are willing to fight wars. So the skeptics emerge in order, and particularly, as you mentioned Thomas Hobbes just now, in particular to challenge the veracity of these things. When Montaigne, a century before Hobbes and Descartes, revived Pyrrhonic skepticism, he had the same things in mind. because he wanted to, because if people can only recognize the subjectivity of their opinions, then they would keep their opinions to themselves and not fight wars. Yeah, so that's one possible reason why skepticism was being fostered, developed. Another reason, like Descartes, why he would be interested to, in his discourse on method and then his meditations on philosophy, why he developed arguments that seems to support certain skeptical positions, also is with regards to, again, in order for him to build a new physics that rival Aristotelian physics, because remember that the church committed itself to a particular position in physics that that was no longer tenable, but the church was holding on jealously to that position, i.e. the impetus theory of Aristotle, the Ptolemaic conception of astronomy, and what is at stake is their control over the population. So if the church was wrong, and they have insofar defended, say, certain religious doctrines, say dogmatism, such as that they speak on behalf of God, the infallibility of the Pope, and so on. So if they were fundamentally wrong in, say, their physical theories, which they claim to have the backing of say, their scripture, then it challenges their power structure. So therefore, the skeptics have a lot to gain with regards to challenging dogmatism. So skepticism runs at the other spectrum of dogmatism. So dogmatism allows a person to claim, say, monopoly and adherence to the truth. Skepticism allows for the greater degree of, say, differences. However, if taken to extremes, skepticism, especially moral and ethical relativism, which is a consequence of skepticism, may prove destructive to society and morality. If truly you are committed to be an ethical skeptic, for example, then morality becomes a matter of might makes right, or morality becomes a matter of convention, or morality becomes a matter of, personal subjective choice. And if that were so, then what is to prevent, say, a nation, an individual, from corrupting themselves and destroying others? Now, this also, with regards to Immanuel Kant, yes, why did he reject metaphysics, as for to him being a deceptive guide to reality, metaphysics being beyond the ken of human intellect? Accordingly, Kant began with a thorough investigation of the powers of human reason. So he saw that his interest was to defend the statements of, say, natural science, meaning to say there were several discoveries that were made in Kant's lifetime and the one before, and the most prized being the discoveries of, say, Newton in his Principium Mathematica, and the discovery of calculus and the developments of mathematics and developments of experimental science. He wanted to ensure that there is a strong metaphysical foundation for that. But yet, what can ensure that, say, the deliverances of the senses is somehow valid? So that's why he sought to write his critique. Yes, the critique of pure reason aims to establish that what you discover in the external world is somehow correct due to the categories of your reasoning. So he discovers and he clarifies in a very meticulous and a very industrious manner just exactly what these categories are and exactly what the limits are, including, for example, how arithmetic is possible, how geometry is possible based on the intuition of space and time, being to say that these are all within the cognitive grasp of the intellect. However, as for metaphysics, he's saying that there is nothing within pure reason that can suggest either one position is tenable or another position is tenable. In other words, he argues for the poverty of human reason to discover metaphysical truths, such as the existence of God, such as the existence of the afterlife, such as the truth of moral injunctions. Now, these three, according to Kant, lie beyond the capacity of the human intellect, or rather the human reason, but they ought to be affirmed as fundamental first principles in the realm of practical ethics in order to ensure, say, stability, and in order to be able to act upon moral injunctions. So that's Kant. Professor Al-Parslan has developed this Kantian notion of epistemology in his very illuminating article, which is part and parcel of that Fashrift dedicated to Professor Naqib Alatas. Prof. Al-Parslan is saying that Kant is not wrong in outlining the limits of pure reason, but he's just saying that what Kant did not realize is that reason, which is that organizing principle in the mind, is in reality merely half of the cognitive capacity of mankind. So, in other words, reason is part and parcel of the spiritual organ of cognition, which is the spirit, which is the soul, which is the heart. And this heart, yes, has its own capacities to discern the truth, such as, for example, the ability to assent to things which can be which has been revealed, and assent to spiritual guidance, and so on and so forth. I hope that answers the question that you posed, Professor Sapora.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting.
All right. So now the next question, perhaps we discussed this, but what was it that made the increased interest in Greek literature? I think you mentioned several points. Yes. What caused increased interest in Greek literature, as we said just now, was that first, they grew wary of the scholastic disputes, yes, in the universities. And secondly, when some of these editions became available, some of them, the literature that did arrive in, say, Florence and other parts of Europe, arrived from Byzantium. Remember, Byzantium is another untapped potential for Europe. Remember, earlier on in history, during the time of, say, the late antiquity, Roman Empire split into the eastern half, yes, came to be known as Byzantium, and the west. The west then, after the time of Charlemagne, developed itself into Western Europe, populated mainly by the Franks and the European races, and they continued to develop their civilization, and undergoing the Middle Ages, and then absorbing from, say, from Arab and Islamic civilization and so on, and continued to develop in that fashion. Byzantine, on the other hand, whereas the West developed its civilization in Latin, Byzantine developed its civilization in Greek. It continued to develop the Aristotelian and the Platonic tradition in Greek fashion, like that. So then in the 15th century, they started paying more interest with regards to the voyages of discovery and so on into these texts, which then became more available. Certainly, the interest grew out of humanism and grew out of their desire to, because they saw the Middle Ages as being a decadent period, a period in which civilization was forestalled, or rather stagnated. So in order to give itself, say, fresh impetus for civilizational development, they translated these texts, and truly they looked to the Greeks and the Latins as the true civilizational summit. Another thing that influenced their translation and the enthusiasm about the Greeks and the Romans and the Latins, especially Cicero, through translations of the Latin works, was that according to them, this period of the grand Roman Empire, before the advent of Christianity, say, became derailed as a result of the influence of the Hebraic aspect of civilization. They wanted to return to that former glory. So they followed initially not only the philosophy and the letters, but also architecture, influences in art, in all aspects, including music. So that's what made them that's what piqued their interest in these things. And also, of course, with their discovery of, say, Plato and the beauty of his writings, which is just juxtaposed with the dryness of the treatises written by the scholastic theologians. If possible, could you elaborate how Occam focusing on the particulars set the direction of the spirit? In what way? I followed that he focused on the particulars, but did not follow what and what result and why. Yes. Remember, in Aquinas, the focus on the universals made the activity of philosophy deductive in nature. Deductive means how to proceed to particulars from universals. But if you deny the existence of universals altogether and affirm only the existence of particulars, that would prepare the ground of inductive logic or inductive science, meaning to say how to move to general conclusions from the observation of particulars. Since what exists are merely particular things, the behavior of particular things became more interesting to the observers. But if you affirm in, say, deduction and you prefer syllogism, you will see that the system of writing in Aquinas is to proceed, say, from fundamental principles and to then to derive the conclusions. But science cannot proceed on deduction alone. In fact, there are very few conclusions that are given. In fact, only logical only logical principles are given via means of deduction. But in terms of the induction, the inductive tendency of the intellect, that's the way forward to develop the medical science, to develop all sciences pertaining to the physical world. I hope that answers your question. Is that from Sister Raja? While we wait, if there are other questions that you'd like to ask, I also want to make an announcement, or perhaps seeking your apology also, that I was informed by some of my friends and colleagues in CASIS that our classes would be starting in the weekdays. So I do not think I can commit in the Tuesday and Tuesday night sessions. If it is okay with the audience, with our participants, I like to propose instead that we will have our sessions on Saturday. So that means that instead of cramming everything in 2 weeks, we will spread it in 4 weeks. We will meet, in 4 Saturdays or 3 Saturdays, excluding this one. If you all agree, then inshallah we'll continue to meet on perhaps the same day and time until we complete our material. All right. Any other question? As usual, if your questions are perhaps require some reflection before you are ready to post them, you can always send it in your group, and then the organizers will then send it to me, and inshallah we will begin our next session by addressing those very questions. I thank you very much for your indulgence and your attention, and please forgive me for the technical defects and say perhaps lack of conceptual clarity on some aspects. Feel free to revisit some of these questions again. All right, is that all? Is there any questions that I have missed out? Okay. If there are no questions, then inshallah until we meet again. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.